And anytime that I brought back all A's and one B, guess what my parents focused on? They looked at that B.
My guest today is a therapist.
We have to be able to tolerate some level of discomfort in order to experience moments of transformation and growth. It's all about making meaning.
Mental health and work culture expert.
We're not necessarily addressing the systemic concerns that drive people to feel burned out.
An overachiever.
We're committed to always developing and growing. Mental health is universal. We need coping tools, and we need to approach situations from a point of curiosity.
Nidhi, welcome to Unmatched. I'm so excited to have you today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely, me too. And as I've mentioned before, total fangirl moment. I've been following you for more than a year across different social media platforms. So I'm very excited to have you today and have hopefully a meaningful chat about mental health. So thanks once again.
Oh, I appreciate that you've been following me, and I've been following you behind the scenes too. So great that we could connect.
So Nidhi, I know who you are because I'm a follower, and you are a mental health and work culture expert. You are a therapist. But what I love more about your story and the thing that made me connect with you in the first place, and the reason why I feel like I have a lot in common, is because part of your story is that you say you are an overachiever. And being an overachiever has led you to basically where you are today. And I would love for you to tell us that story for our listeners to hear how you ended up being a therapist and how being an overachiever sort of was part of that journey for you.
Yeah, I grew up as a first generation immigrant here in the United States. And my dad's an engineer, and my mom is highly accomplished as somebody with a law degree and an economics degree. And achievement was something that was critical in our household. I was the kind of student where I would aim for straight A's. And anytime that I brought back all A's and one B, guess what my parents focused on? They looked at that B. So I learned from Yeah, right? I learned from a very young age, 100%. I learned from a very young age that it wasn't okay to be imperfect and that I needed to achieve at the highest level in order to avail of the opportunities that existed out in the world. So I was a really good kid. I got a 3.9 GPA in high school, and I ended up getting a full scholarship to go to college, which was fantastic. It was what I had hoped for all along. But when I got to college in my sophomore year, I started to struggle. I stopped showing up to my classes. I stopped completing the schoolwork. And one day I received a letter from the scholarship committee saying that my grades were so low, I was running the risk of losing my scholarship and being kicked out of this program. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but the reason why I was struggling so much was because I had an anxiety disorder that I was trying to use partying and alcohol to cope with. So I had a choice in that moment. The scholarship department told me, you can either get some help and work with a therapist and keep your scholarship, get your grades back on track, or you potentially lose everything that you've worked so hard for. Now, I don't know about your background, but in my culture, we don't talk about mental health. It's not a topic of discussion. I had never heard about the idea of anxiety. I didn't know what trauma was. And so when I went to see a therapist for the first time, it was an eye-opening experience for me because I realized that there was something much deeper going on in my life, and it was affecting my ability to function. So I went through my own healing journey and came out of it wanting to give other people that same experience. I wanted to help other people to be able to heal and envision a brighter future for themselves. And that's what led me to go to graduate school and become a licensed therapist.
That's amazing. And it resonates so much. And by the way, I mean, I just want to, put the record straight. It's not so much like the parents did that, but it's more like the culture that we were brought up into. And I come from Eastern Europe, so it's a very similar approach to achievement, and to society imposes very high standards, right, for everyone. So yeah, I come from the same type of background. The only difference is that I didn't figure that out until very late in my end of my 30s, that was an issue. So I've been like on this path of trying to overdo myself over and over and over and over again, until almost sort of a burnout, and then the healing process started. So very, very late in my life. So I'm curious to learn from you before we dive in, because I think there's so much to unpack here, right? For especially in leadership today. But I'm curious to know, just as a headline, what's your relationship with trauma in general? How do you view it? How do you feel it for yourself as a person, versus how does that translate in your job as a therapist?
I think trauma is something that I've learned to interact with in a very intimate way because my entire career has been focused on it. And I myself have also survived what I now recognize as traumas in my life. I think we all to some degree in our lives will encounter some level of trauma. And as a therapist, it has been my greatest pleasure to work with C-suite executives, people that are high level achievers who also are trauma survivors. So I found that, first of all, many people don't even realize that they've encountered a trauma because we think about a trauma as a natural disaster or war, which are absolutely traumatic experiences. But that trauma is really anything that overwhelms our capacity to cope. And many of us have situations in our lives that we've had to navigate that fit that bill, that fit that definition. And learning how to be able to make sense and make meaning of those experiences, I think, is such a key part of healing.
And that leads me to the first question about mental health. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like it's more and more a topic that everyone talks about. And I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, not to mention 20 or 30 years ago, it was not such a topic that everyone would have on top of their minds. Now, I'm wondering, why is that? Is it because there's more of it? There's more issues in the world? Or is it just because that we were not talking about it in the past, and now everyone is more aware and everyone is more understanding of what that means and is also more open to talk about it?
I think that when we know better, we can do better. And so there have been a lot of realizations for a lot of people over, especially these last 3 years, that mental health is universal and that we all have encountered from time to time difficulties with our mental health. There was such a stigma and taboo about discussing mental health conditions up until really 2020, because I feel like people had a preconceived notion and a judgment that came with the idea of being depressed or having PTSD or coping with bipolar disorder, whatever that diagnosis might look like. And when 2020 hit in the pandemic, we all immediately experienced this isolation, this lack of connection. And if you had something that was underlying mental health wise, it surely got exacerbated when 2020 through really this past year, all of these years, right? So I find that there's a shift in what's acceptable in our society. I find that there's a shift in recognizing and wanting to attend to mental health because we've seen what a tremendous impact it can make, not only in our personal lives, but also in our work lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's been such an amazing moment in history, right? That sort of common trauma was felt across the globe by almost everyone at the same time. So talk to me about like what that meant for in terms of your practice. Did you see a shift before and after the pandemic in terms of how many people were coming to see you about mental health issues?
In 2020, everything in my practice changed because I had just opened up my practice in January 2020. I had been transitioning from a group practice to my own solo practice for about a year. And I remember opening those doors, so looking forward to working with clients that year in person. But of course, 2 months later, March 2020, the world shut down, and all of us who were therapists and helping professionals had to shift our model to doing virtual care. And prior to the pandemic, of course, there was a steady stream of clients coming in. But oh my goodness, once 2020 hit, I had wait lists. I still have a wait list to this day that's about 6 months long because I just can't, I don't have enough space in my schedule to see all of these people that really need help and support. So I think that there was this massive influx of people that were disoriented, that were traumatized, that felt scared about what the future was going to bring, and recognized that a valuable resource in processing that and navigating that was to go to therapy and to work with somebody alongside them in that journey.
And you make a great point. And actually, one of the reasons that I wanted to do this episode specifically on mental health is I was recently talking to a friend who was telling me that literally everyone around him was talking about mental health and anxiety issues, from his mom, kids, nieces, nephews, mother-in-laws, wife. Everyone seemed to be bringing this topic forward in a way that was unprecedented to him. And it seems to me from what you're saying that this is exactly that. It has been such an crazy time for everyone to go through that it's almost like we didn't know how to process it.
Yeah, it was a collective experience that was quite devastating when you really think back on it. It's hard to even believe that it's been 3 years since that time when everything shut down. But as I reflect back on it, how much anxiety and stress and overwhelm, people's livelihoods were being affected. People didn't know whether they were going to be able to see their family members again because if their family members got sick, you didn't have access to them. And something that I've been reflecting on from the clinician perspective is that one of the interesting pieces of the pandemic was that therapists were going through the exact same stressor that our clients were. That's a rare situation. Normally, our clients are coming to us, they're dealing with relationship stuff, they're stressed out at work, but we're not in it with them. We're not literally going through this experience alongside them. And the psychological toll that came from that on us as helping professionals was immense.
Yeah, I can totally imagine that. So let's forget about the pandemic for a moment. I just think it's crazy to look at it now with this new perspective, right, of the pandemic. But if you eliminate that and you look at the workplace, it's already pretty clear that we're all people mixing together lots of different personalities and traumas and backgrounds, and so cultural backgrounds as well. That alone is sort of a little bit of a recipe for disaster, if you will, because you mix all those people together, it's bound to get uncomfortable or crazy or interesting or good or whatever, all the 50 shades of gray within that small space where you're spending like 8 hours a day. So I'm just curious to understand, how is the modern workplace affecting mental health versus, say, 20, 30 years ago? Do you feel there's a change in how we work today that is affecting mental health in any way?
Yes, I think that now in the workplace, while there are some accommodations through remote work, hybridized work, that there is still a high level of pressure for achievement, and that there is an expectation, even in healthy organizations, the top Fortune 50s that we think about, to still overachieve and to accomplish beyond what may be feasible in an 8-hour workday. And so I find that what's happening within the culture, in corporate culture, that we're incorporating a lot of well-being initiatives, that we're starting to recognize that we need coping tools and we need to approach situations from a point of curiosity. But we're not necessarily addressing the systemic concerns that drive people to feel burned out, to feel like they're struggling from an emotional standpoint. So while we've made some progress, I feel like there's still a lot of room to grow here in the corporate sphere and from a leadership standpoint in truly embracing mental health, not only on the individual level, but also looking at the systemic contributors to mental health struggles in the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And what would you say is the role of the individual in this, though? Because I don't want to take the part of the employer necessarily or the other, but I feel like there's always a two-way street here, right? I mean, we're all sort of in charge of our own well-being, if you will, whether it's health and how much we sleep and what we eat and how much we work out. This is also part of it, right? And I think we individually haven't really been aware of how important that is. But I'm wondering, how much is that also a factor that the individual takes charge of that part of what well-being actually means?
Yes, I agree with you 100%. I think both sides move in conjunction with one another. And so we do have to take responsibility for our own health and well being. And that means that we create routines and create practices in our day to day lives that help us to cultivate a positive mental state. And you mentioned sleep, diet is a piece of that. Connection to other people is huge. Being able to ensure that if you are somebody who needs more time to recharge, that you're not just waiting until the weekend to get in all your recharge time, hoping it's going to undo 40 hours of stress, right? It doesn't work like that. We have to be intentional in how we build in these practices on an individual level that ensure that we can sustain ourselves and not feel burned out in the long run. So I completely agree with you. I think they go hand in hand.
If I'm going to be a little bit devil's advocate here for a second, coming from Eastern Europe with, growing up in very different conditions, right? And having witnessed prior generations live a very intense, simple, but also quite difficult life at time, they didn't seem to be consumed by mental health that much. They sort of had these mechanisms of just carry on, do it. And I've never heard anyone in my, in my environment, in my family, in the past, when I was growing up, when I was little, or my friends, friends of the family whatsoever, to talk about mental health concerns or issues. So I'm wondering, where does this concern now comes from? Considering that we supposedly live a much better life now, right? A much more abundant life. We have access to so much information and technology. Is that exactly the reason why we're feeling more overwhelmed than prior generations? Or where do you think this is coming from?
I think that prior generations felt overwhelmed, but like you said, the mentality was very different, and there wasn't a choice of go to see a therapist, talk to somebody about it. That wasn't even on the table as an option. So like when I think back ancestrally, I come from Indian heritage, and in 1947 there was this big event called partition. It was basically like a civil war within the country of India. And so a lot of people were displaced, a lot of people lost family members, and they experienced pretty intense trauma, but they trudged on through, they pushed through it. What actually happened, though, if you look closely, is that those mental health conditions came out as substance use. So there were increased rates of alcoholism. A lot of numbing happened as a result of experiencing these adverse events. It came out as domestic violence, abuse. And so it was more behind the scenes, less external expression, more behind the scenes expression of mental health struggles that we can now look back and label as such, right? But we didn't necessarily have that language or that understanding of what was actually happening underneath that external stoicism of everything is fine, I'm pushing through, it doesn't affect me. So I think a lot of times when we look back at when I look back on past generations, there was a mask that we wore that is now being taken off. And now we can express what's underneath that mask because we have the language to do so.
Yeah, I totally agree. I also have the same feeling that it was always there, but it was something that was not really spoken of a lot. The other thing is, what I personally feel is that the level of connection between communities, between people, within families, was much, much closer because there was not so much entertainment available out there. So, coming to the topic of technology, the internet, and social media, and all that, how do you feel that alone has, affected how we connect and how we feel about mental health and how that is impacting actually the mental health nowadays?
Social media is a absolute double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it's such a beautiful mechanism to be able to reconnect with family that's overseas or to follow people. Like I've enjoyed following you, and we're in different continents, right? I wouldn't have gotten the chance to do that had it not been for social media. But the other end of the spectrum with social media is that it can be incredibly detrimental to our mental health. It creates a disconnection in our day-to-day lives to the people that are in the same spaces as we are. Think about how many many hours we spend on our phones scrolling, right? When we have family members or kids that are needing our attention in that moment. And that we also have to look at the fact that because social media provides a platform where people can put their best selves out there, you don't usually see people posting about the fact that they got rejected from a job or went through this horrific breakup or encountered this tragic car accident. You very rarely will see those types of posts. And instead, it's the highlight reel for so many people. So that creates anxiety, it creates depressive symptoms, it creates a comparison between ourselves and everybody else out there. And the feeling and belief that maybe I'm not good enough compared to Sally down the street, right? So I think that there's a lot of beauty that comes from social media, but there's a lot of research that backs up the fact that it does negatively and detrimentally affect our mental health. We have to be cautious about what we consume and put some limits in terms of who we follow and what we follow.
Yeah, completely agree. And since a while, I've been a very loyal adopter of this idea of content diet. And I try to do content dieting quite a lot, and select who I follow and what I do and how long do I stay on social media. Unfortunately, the other side of it is that it becomes also part of your work. So in my case, as a marketer, and this is sort of like the bottom line of this whole conversation is when technology, internet, social media becomes where you're doing your job every day and where you sort of like need to be in touch with what is happening and following up on all the different changes. And it changes so much on a daily basis, right? I mean, I'm sure that other industries are going through the same, but marketing is something else. Every day there's something new. There's a new platform. There's a new algorithm. There's something that you need to be aware of. And so I feel like that's already unprecedented, that it's becoming part of your everyday 8-hour type of work, that you need to be connected to this amount of input on one side, but also change on the other side. And so the question that sort of gets me thinking is like, how do we manage that? This need to know more, to be on top of everything that is happening and not have this fear of missing out, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a very blurred line, right? Because social media is a way to decompress, but when it's a part of your job and your day-to-day life as a marketing leader or any type of leadership position, thought leadership, it's like compelling you to want to engage in a professional manner. And I've found that having very clear boundaries in your work life versus your personal life, being able to delineate how you're going to then create a separation so that you can get your time back right after work hours. What that might look like is that after 5 p.m., no more messages are getting checked, no more news articles are being read, no more posts are being read. And instead, it's an intentional practice of being present with the people or the pets or, the hobbies that bring you joy and that, bring you fulfillment in your life. I found that creating those emotional boundaries are especially important because you're speaking to this idea of FOMO and feeling like there's something out there that you could maybe speak to or comment on. And accepting that there will always be 24 hours of content out there. That same article will be there tomorrow for you to find, star, and come back to. It's not an imperative for you to respond to it right now in this exact moment and to manage our own anxiety about that, because often we feel like there's a pressure that's being placed on us when really it's an internal pressure that's driving our behavior.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I find it hilarious that you're saying like the article is still there, because that's exactly me. I feel like there's something that I don't know that I need to know about, and that gives me total anxiety all the time. So what are the boundaries that you specifically adopt? Because what is interesting is that you're a therapist, but you're also a speaker and you're also a social media personality, and you have built quite an impressive following on different platforms. And it's actually part of your business to be on those platforms to promote, your message and your services and your speaking engagements. And it's part of that sort of idea of this is business for you, right? And so it's not even the fact that you want to find out about different things, but it's really literally is this is how I promote my work, which is fundamental, right, to grow in any type of business. What is your approach to it, and how do you set boundaries for yourself in that?
Oh my gosh, it has been hard. Let me tell you, Anna, it's been really difficult to find this balance because my personality as a human being is my personality as a thought leader and as a social media personality, as you put it, right? Like they meld together in a lot of ways. And that's my authentic self. So it can be really difficult sometimes to feel okay taking a step back or to feel as though I can, emotionally disconnect from the content that's being put out there. The way that I manage it is probably something that people don't love. Like one thing that I do on a weekly basis is I have a set time that I respond to messages. Now, unless I know that there is a pressing engagement that I'm going to have to participate in, I'm usually not checking my LinkedIn messages. I'm not really looking at my my Instagram messages. I'm taking some time away. And then when I have space on Monday afternoon to sit there and respond, that's when I respond to everybody. Some people may get frustrated with me because I'm not an instantaneous responder, but for me, it's an important boundary that I've had to put into place to ensure that I don't feel like I'm always on demand. And I think that that is the toughest part about being a content creator is feeling like you always have to be on and always have to be creating. My delicious dinner from yesterday doesn't have to be my next LinkedIn post. Like it doesn't have to be like that. I can just enjoy things for myself and not feel compelled to create content from it.
That's really funny. So, what is your system in terms of content creation? I know that there's different platforms require a different approach. What would you say is the system that works for you in order for you to have that detachment from it a little bit, as you say?
A lot of repurposing. So I have gotten into a good flow on LinkedIn, which felt like the most overwhelming platform to create on because you have to put these thought provoking, hook you in the first line posts that are informative and entertaining at the same time. And it's a lot of pressure to try to create content on a daily basis that's going to resonate with your audience. And so I had to get really good at repurposing my content. What I'll do is I'll take a comment that I post on one of the massive leadership pages, for example, and I'll spend maybe 15, 20 minutes crafting this comment and I'll see what gets traction. That comment that gets traction now becomes a post on LinkedIn and I expand upon it. I maybe add a tip or two in there. And that has allowed me to be creative and spontaneous in my content creation while still making my weekly and day-to-day content for my audience. For Instagram, I took a step back for quite a while because I was feeling burned out on creating reels and video content. And I've started to now repurpose some of my LinkedIn written content into video form. So I'm finding ways to be able to take where I've already invested energy and multi-purpose it. So I'm not now expending additional energy to come up with a whole new idea. I'm instead now communicating it through a video platform versus through a written platform.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds very, very smart. And I think a lot of people do exactly that. And I have to say, I think we're not alone in this feeling always on for different reasons and not just social media. I think in general, many corporate executives feel this feeling of you need to be always on, whether it's technology, whether it's constant shifts, on social media, whether it's AI, something is there to give you any sort of anxiety. So I'm wondering what advice would you give those those executives that feel that pressure? How can they take a little bit of that pressure off?
I think it would be important to reframe how we're viewing being on, because I think one of the most impactful changes a leader can make is taking that time to disconnect so that they can show up with 100% energy when they are actually on. The reality is your battery is finite. So if you're spending 12 hours a day, 8 hours at work, 4 hours after work, creating content and putting your thought leadership out there and responding to emails and thinking and allowing mental energy to go towards trying to problem solve a particular issue you're encountering as a leader, then you're that much depleted coming back into that next day, which means you're less present with your teams. You're probably less focused in the moment when you're actually at work. And so I think instead of viewing being always on as a positive, as some sort of badge of honor, we should instead reframe it and see that the downtime, the time that we're off, the time that we're separating ourselves from our work actually allows you to show up and function completely differently while you are on. If we can look at one as in the service of other, I think it helps to reduce that guilt that we might feel from disconnecting from our work.
And I think there's another component that is, with so much information coming at you all the time, at least in my case, what I find a lot of times, especially with the mobile phone, is to really be able to focus. I think there's a little bit of a fake feeling of feeling always on. It's not really true. In my opinion, I think just a feeling, because you're either looking at your phone and then you're looking at your screen at your computer, and then something pops up and there's a notification here and then there's something there. Here's the article that is popping up and is, the latest thing that I need to read. And it feels like attention is just going into too many different directions. There's a little bit of a difficulty to focus on one thing. At least I sometimes find myself in that situation. How can we work around that? Of course, you can turn the phone on, you can eliminate notifications, but what are the tips would you have for making sure that you stay focused on the task?
Eliminating your distractions and creating the environment that is promoting a focus, right? That promotes focus. If we're sitting in front of the TV with our phone and LinkedIn or Instagram just scrolling, or TikTok just scrolling, and we have all of these distractions around us, no wonder we're attending to 50 things, because we have 50 things going. I think we have to ensure that we're setting ourselves up for success, making sure that we have quiet time and quiet spaces built in. I make sure that every time I go on my lunch break, which is an hour-long lunch break each day, that I disconnect from every piece of technology. I instead stand outside, I water my plants, I listen to the birds, I look at the beautiful flowers, feel the breeze, and it's enough of a time for me to disconnect that when I do sit down to focus and do something, now I'm hyper focused. Now I've gotten the energy out in a healthy way, versus sitting and being distracted and getting sucked into the time sink that can be social media or your email or whatever that distraction is for you. I think it's so important to recognize that we have to create the conditions for us to be creative, for us to be able to be critical thinkers. And that can't happen when you have a TV show running in the background and you're thinking about the next thing that you're going to be replying to on whatever social media platform you're on, or that email that you need to get back on. So yes, we have to create those conditions to be successful.
Which is very, very hard when you are on top of it, an overachiever, right? An overdoer.
Yes.
Which sounds like, it's really nice, but it's also a little bit of an issue to deal with. How do you sort of organize the stuff that you need to do, trying to achieve at that level, but at the same time trying to stay focused? Do you have any system to prioritize, for example, or how do you organize the work that you have to do throughout the day?
Blocking my time has been huge, because as somebody with ADHD, I have a really difficult time shifting focus from one task to the next, right? When I get in the zone on something, I need to focus and wholeheartedly commit to that thing. And it might be 4 hours of me just sitting there and putting out all types of ideas on the page. And that feels good to me. It feels replenishing in a way. But I can't do that if I have 3 meetings that interrupt that flow state. So I have to block my time. Mondays are my podcast recording days. They're my meeting days. They're the days that I do a lot of my speaker coordination with people that are booking me as a speaker. Coaching, I have a speaking coach that I work with her on Mondays. That's my time to really focus on the things that nurture my business, but in a more personal way. And then other points in the week, I will schedule clients. So I still see some therapy clients. They'll be blocked in. And in the evenings, that's when I will maybe block in some time for social media, but not too long. I split it up into much smaller segments. So just being able to recognize what my strengths are and where my weaknesses lie as a high performer has allowed me to adapt my schedule to accommodate what I need and to work in a way that works for me.
Yeah, sure, it makes sense. And do you feel there's misconceptions around mental health these days that you're encountering, whether it's in the workplace or in general in society? Do you feel like there's a lot of those things that you'd say, yeah, no, it's not really like that?
I think a lot of workplaces are still struggling to understand neurodiversity because we hear about depression, we hear about anxiety, we know about ADHD on a very surface level. But I think leaders need to get in touch with what that looks like on the ground and how to support people. So often they think like depression looks like somebody crying in their office or they're not showing up to work, absenteeism. But depression can look like isolation, like hiding out in your office and being a little bit more disconnected from your teams. It can look like procrastination. It can look like low energy, low motivation. And so really recognizing that depression isn't going to look like the most severe example that you might think it could, that it's going to show up differently. Anxiety may show up as, difficulties being able to make decisions or needing a lot of information from your boss or from your leader, because when you have information, it helps to quell your anxiety a bit. These are the things that I think leaders think look one way, but it really looks a different way. And we have to learn how to adapt and attune to the unique needs of the neurodiverse workforce that we're employing and that we're leading. And if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I don't have neurodiverse people, I promise you, you do. You 100% do. We make up a pretty big segment of the population. So we got to get on top of it and learn how to be able to support people with these unique needs.
100% agree. And what would you say are the best tools as leaders to learn how to cope with these situations, right? Because you sort of, in the corporate environment, you become leader of a team overnight, right? It's a little bit like becoming a parent. You're not necessarily going through a process of, okay, I'm in the process of becoming, like, you get promoted, you get a team, one by one, and then sort of maybe the team becomes bigger, and then all of a sudden you have a team of 10 or 20 people or 100 people, and you're not necessarily personally equipped to deal with such, diverse amount of people that you need to manage at one point, and maybe you don't have the tools, or you might not even have the personality to deal with that. And how do you think that we can deal with that as leaders to make sure that we are prepared for those situations so that we can support our teams in an adequate manner?
I think the first piece of this is to recognize that nobody expects you to be a therapist, to be a licensed professional that understands the ins and outs of each and every diagnosis. That would be unreasonable. What is expected of you as a leader is to be curious and to be connected to the people that you're leading. And that means that you have to know the right questions to ask and how to create the trust within your team so that people feel comfortable sharing with you. So some of the best phrases that I could recommend to people are, tell me more about. When you notice that somebody might be having a difficult time, say, with their stress, and you're noticing it, tell me more about what might be affecting your day-to-day when you're here at work, right? I'm curious to hear, how this project that just got put on your plate, how that might be affecting you right now. Those types of questions are going to cue you into what somebody's internal experience is. And by asking the right questions, you're able to gather the information. The answers to how to support people are in there. You can also be direct and ask somebody, hey, I know you've got a lot going on right now. What would be the most helpful way for me to support you? And you might provide a menu of options. I can check in on you, once a week, and I really want to be here to be a listening ear. So we could schedule some one-on-one time. Or I can look at, bringing in one of your colleagues to collaborate with you on this project because I know this got chucked on your plate. So we can engage some additional supports. Or that maybe I can link you to your EAP services or, to some supports that we have built into your benefits suite. All of these are options that you could put out there and then give people the choice and the autonomy to decide how you can support them.
Let's talk about generations for a second, because just like in any family, you might end up being in an environment at work where maybe three different generations coexist in one place, right? Which is pretty unique typically. And that might create issues because of hierarchies, because of ways of understanding the world and work ethics and levels, standards of at which you want to deliver things. And there might be there an inequality in how people perceive what you need to deliver towards work. And in your case, as a high achiever, whether you are in whatever place within the hierarchy, how do you feel that we can manage those differences? Right? Because there's so many stereotypes where, Gen Zers only want to do the easy bits, and millennials are too focused and too over delivering, and I don't know, baby boomers do this and that and the other. I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions around generations and the way each generation does things. That I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on how do you bring it all together and on the same level again.
As leaders, we're committed to always developing and growing. And so we all have blind spots. Every single one of us, regardless of what generation we come from, we have areas that we may not resonate with in other generations. I think it's important to have the awareness of what those blind spots are, right? Because we make a lot of generalizations about boomers, and boomers make a lot of generalizations about Gen Zers, but where's the common ground there, and what's driving that assumption? It's like, what are we thinking or presuming about somebody just because they belong to a particular generation? We have to look at kind of what those roots are. And I think that, when we have hierarchies and we have some of these systems in place that are typical in the corporate sphere, part of what builds psychological and safety and trust is having more of that collaborative atmosphere versus a hierarchical atmosphere. So it may be an opportunity to also look at how can we incorporate elements of that? Is that through a town hall where upper level leadership is meeting with the company at large and taking an opportunity to get to know people at different levels? Is it in being able to schedule time and repurposing the way that we utilize our time? Maybe repurposing is the wrong word, editing how we utilize our time to prioritize those human connections. But I think that we have to recognize that there are going to be generational differences and that we still need to be able to do our best to connect on a human level, which transcends any type of generational gap that may exist between us. If we can take the time to approach even that from curiosity, to understand what the circumstances are that each generation has grown up in, then we can better understand how that informs their perspectives and their worldview and what they bring to the workplace.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna be a typical millennial now, and I'm gonna bring up the topic of discomfort here, which is a topic that is very interesting to me because on one side it feels like we're in a space in our society where we want to make it all so easy for everyone, right? Which is good. We want to live better. We want to have better well-being in general. We want to sleep better, work better, get to a level that is extremely, extremely comfortable to us and makes us happy. And I think that's amazing. And I think we've never been in that situation before in history until right now. So that's great. On the other side, coming from where I'm coming from and having, grown up with a lot of discomfort, I feel that discomfort also plays a role in growth. And this might be completely old-fashioned, so happy that you share your thinking there, but I feel that a little bit of discomfort is not so bad when you see it as a way for you to develop and to grow further. So tell me a little bit how you see that little conflict in between how we're trying to make things extra easy for our youth, for our kids, versus what actually discomfort can bring as a benefit to them.
Both realities can exist, right? We can have a lot of things that have been optimized for our comfort and to give us ease in our day to day lives, and still recognize that our dreams absolutely die in our comfort zones. So we have to be able to tolerate some level of discomfort in order to experience moments of transformation and growth. And I think that distress tolerance and the ability to tolerate discomfort is an integral skill for anybody, but especially for people who are leaders, right? Part of what we were talking about a moment ago with generational gaps is a discomfort that we avoid and project onto other people, make assumptions about them because we've done it this way all along. They must be wrong. But we've never taken a moment to check in on that discomfort. Well, why is that? Why am I feeling so threatened by a 4-day work week? Is it because I've had to work 60 years at a 5-day work week, 40 hours a week? And I feel like that's a lot of time I've invested. So other people should do that too. That's okay that you think that, but it's important to connect with that experience. So discomfort is the driver of success and of growth. And so one of the best ways for us to tolerate and learn to build that muscle is by sitting with it. What that means is that we don't try to distract away, we don't avoid it, we don't try to just push past it. We instead acknowledge all that we're thinking, feeling, and experiencing when we're in a moment of uncertainty, when we're in a moment of doubt, and to be able to glean lessons from that. It's all about making meaning. So if we can take a moment of discomfort and take something away, oh, that's teaching me that I have this area that I feel like an imposter in. I need to look at that further. That's wonderful. That's the launch pad now for your next area of hyper growth. So it's an integral skill and one that I think people at every single level of leadership need to be looking at developing.
But how do you make sure that it's still there? I mean, I'm asking now as a mom of two very little boys and trying to instill in them the right work ethics without the additional trauma, hopefully. But like, what's the fine line? Because if you push too hard, it goes into a different direction, which is not necessarily beneficial. But if you're not pushing enough, it might just end up not being what they need in order to thrive and grow further. So how do you know when enough is enough? You know what I mean?
Yes. The distinction, I think, comes between the idea of eustress versus distress. Stress is not inherently bad. Adversity is not inherently bad. There's a certain amount of stress and anxiety that propels us forward, that motivates us, that drives us. So with your boys, right, allowing them to encounter a little bit of stress, a little bit of discomfort is great because that's what's going to make them want to push harder, perform better, be able to commit more to whatever it is that they're passionate about. It's when eustress becomes distress, where we're perpetually overwhelmed, where we feel like the task ahead is so far beyond our reach that we're immobilized by it. That's where I think stress becomes challenging and where it stops becoming a growth motivator and instead becomes something that holds back your growth. So I think that if we can distinguish between those two and look at, okay, is this a tolerable amount of stress? Then let me use this as a launch pad for that next area of growth versus, is this an incapacitating level of stress? Then that's where we need to maybe cope with it, move through it, and bring ourselves back to center before we make decisions and move forward.
You have an amazing quote that I found, I think it was on your Instagram page, that I really loved, which says, "Change happens when the discomfort of staying stuck outweighs the comfort of the status quo." I really love it. And tell me what this means to you.
There is a tipping point when it comes to discomfort. A lot of us are willing to be uncomfortable so long as we feel safe and so long as it's a pattern that we are familiar with and recognize. Think about all the unhealthy relationships that people continue to be in year after year because it's all that they know. They're scared of what's on the other side of that relationship. Think about all the promotions that people miss out on because they feel like they're not ready yet. They hold themselves back from going and tipping over the edge. At some point, for that person who has rejected every promotion that's come their way, there will come a time where they no longer are satisfied, where they now recognize, I deserve to make more money. I deserve to be appreciated. I am ready for this next move, even though it's scary and I don't know what's to come. I know I can do it. That's when the discomfort now has become a motivator. That's when it starts to disrupt the status quo. So I think it's being able to recognize that when that tipping point comes and how to be able to leverage it to move you forward, to propagate what you need to do. And that is going to be the defining moment in your life between being stuck and now being steadfast forward.
And there's another quote that I absolutely loved and I resonated so much with that you have on your Instagram account, which says, "Overworking can be a trauma response because stillness feels unsafe." I think it's one of the quotes that have most spoke to me in a long time because I feel exactly like that. Sometimes it's, the not doing is as scary as being overwhelmed. So how do you look at that? How do you work against that so that you can allow yourself to stay still and not do something all the time?
Right. I can relate to what you're saying because I am still on my journey of navigating this. It's when you're a high achiever, there's a sense of self-worth that comes from achieving. It's part of our identities, right? Is being able to accomplish things and fulfill the goal and what's the next goal that we're working towards. And so stillness challenges a piece of our identity because we're not achieving in that moment. We're just being. That's the scary part is we're stuck with these uncomfortable thoughts, these uncomfortable feelings. The biggest feedback I get from people, leaders that I work with, is that when they're still, that's when it all comes flooding back in. All the things that they've avoided are right there for them to face head on. And so I think the more that we're able to practice, even for 30 seconds, observing what am I thinking, feeling, experiencing in my body, how am I moving through this moment? 30 seconds becomes 1 minute, becomes 90 seconds, becomes 2 minutes, and so on and so forth. And you're able to get to a place where now all of a sudden sitting for 30 minutes doesn't feel so scary anymore because you've connected to your internal experience that you were so disconnected from for so long.
And to be honest, something that I've experienced, and thankfully, with the help of different tools and therapy, I've been able to sort of become more and more aware of it, and also try to work against this situation. Was I noticed that I was not allowing myself to do something without some kind of additional activity in the background. So I wouldn't fold the laundry if I wouldn't listen to a podcast. I wouldn't drive if I wasn't listening to something that was not just the radio, something that was giving me some kind of an input that I would have to process. So every single activity that I was doing had some kind of additional background to it. So I was never allowing myself to just be with myself, listening to myself and my thoughts and figuring out what's coming out of there. When I started to practice that, and now I'm trying to implement that every single day and have a time that I have no distraction whatsoever, that I'm just driving with no background, no radio, no podcast, nothing. Or if I go for a walk and I don't take my headphones or whatever, I noticed that that's when you start to really think for yourself. And that's where you start to, listen to this inner voice that you have, and that you start getting ideas and becoming creative, especially for creatives, right? Especially for people, like me in marketing, or that, work in design jobs, any type of job that requires creativity. I feel like there's such a need for these people to just stay still and not do anything for a little bit of time so that they can get a little bit of that energy back once they're on again, as you said before. outside of just saying that, really disconnect for anything, do you have any other tips to give us to sort of make sure that we disconnect from being always on like that?
Well, you said something that's so important, that when we slow down and when we're quiet and we sit with those thoughts, that we're able to be more creative. And I think that boredom is actually the birthplace of creativity. If we allow ourselves to be bored, to be still, to be quiet, we hear and learn so much about ourselves, and our brain is able to process and connect dots that weren't being connected before when we were keeping ourselves constantly busy. So I just wanted to underscore that because I think it's such an important piece. A lot of times people think that if I just keep iterating and keep putting stuff out there, I'll be more creative that way. No, 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 no. Pause, take a step back, allow yourself to be bored and see what incredible ideas come your way. How to be able to do this better, some tips and tricks. I think that being able to create those opportunities and build it in where you can be bored. That means that when your kids are away, they're at school, that might be your opportunity to just take a moment. And I integrate it actually with some of my day-to-day routines. Like my coffee in the morning is one of my mindfulness activities because I'm trying to be extremely present with what's happening as a way to set the tone for my day. I listen to the coffee brewing, I smell it, I use each of my five senses. I taste it I add some cream and sugar to it. I feel the warmth of it. And it helps me to be very centered. So mindfulness doesn't have to be a meditation. It doesn't have to be you sitting for an hour in a yoga class, right? It could be 5 minutes of you making your coffee and just observing what's happening inside as you're doing this activity. When we have input, though, less auditory or that is something that we need to process along the way, that's where I would recommend maybe not using that as your activity, right? So when you're, for example, you were talking about like folding laundry and listening to the podcast, you're not really being present in that moment, right? Because you're so focused on what's going on with the podcast. And it's more like you're on autopilot getting the task done. Instead, you want to pair a task like laundry with maybe quiet music that has no words to it, something that you're familiar with that you may not be tempted to sing along to because there are no words. So instrumentals are great for that. It's still a little bit of input, but it's enough for you to be able to mostly attend to what's happening inside. And for beginners, I find that that's a good starting place because silence just feels deafening. It's so scary to some people that, okay, just have a little music in the background that has no lyrics and see how that goes instead.
Except working out, because I cannot work out if there's not something in the background to get me going. So I do need the podcast there or a YouTube video or anything or music to get me
100%.
going.
I'm with you on that. I know, right? If I need to get in the zone, nothing's going to motivate me more than that song that's pumping and that I hear the lyrics to and I'm singing along to the lyrics. Gosh, that's like my favorite thing. So I feel you on that.
So just as a sum up of the conversation, with mental health, it seems like less is more. So, do less, activate less, try to listen to fewer things, do fewer things, be part of fewer, activities and allow yourself to sort of calm down, listen to yourself, be present, be in the moment, and sort of absorb in specific moments that you can assign throughout the day what the world has to offer. Is that it?
I think that's a great start, and I think we can do more. I think that we can develop greater self-awareness to be able to recognize that as leaders, when we're having a conversation with a team member or a colleague, our own stuff comes up. So that's something we can do more of, is to pay more attention to how our own past shows up in the way that we lead people, because it does. It informs your approach, and it creates the lens through which you view the people in your teams. I think that we can do more in terms of setting boundaries, being okay with sometimes people being disappointed, sometimes people needing to wait a little bit to hear back from us. We have such a culture of urgency that we could do more to be intentional about how we protect our time and protect our space. So those are some of the areas where I feel like we could invest more time and energy and maybe increase our efforts versus do less.
It's been so valuable, and I feel like we could spend hours and hours talking about this. Maybe there's going to be a part two episode to continue talking. But for now, I just wanted to say thank you for your time, and it's been really valuable to hear from you and to sort of bring us back to where we need to be in terms of, being balanced and being present, and understanding that our, the best asset, the biggest asset that we have is our health. No matter if it's our physical health, if it's our mental health. If we don't have those two things, we're not able to achieve more. We're not able to actually do more. So it is really important to protect those. So thank you so much for being here and talking to us today. And I'm really hoping to speak to you really soon.
Yes, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved the conversation. You let me know when there's a part two. And I hope that everybody remembers that, you're replaceable at your job, but your mental health and your physical health are not replaceable. So take good care of yourself.